Let's have Errol Morkoc join us from California to discuss the Israel-Gaza issue. Sorry, I know you're very busy, Errol, but let's just have you talk about, the Israel-Gaza issue for a bit. What is your assessment on the pause of hostage exchanges and aid stops to Gaza?
Comes down to the leadership that Donald Trump has put forth, and he has put forth a leadership style that is going to favor hostages and humanitarianism above all else, which conflicts, of course, with the stopping of aid or humanitarian aid into Gaza. But I think it's very difficult for somebody to be, on the one hand, claiming to want a ceasefire, to respect the holy month of Ramadan, and still is keeping hostages of people they've stolen from Israel, some of these hostages being Americans. I think much like reading the room and understanding who you're dealing with is important, they made a huge mistake, and I refer to Hamas in general, by bringing out the Israeli hostages in sort of parade style. They brought them on stage, they had them read statements of contrition, and then they finally released them. And you could see the condition of these people was very bad. And at the same time, bodies were also returned to Israel, and in coffins, children, babies, little cute babies. So I think that timing of all that didn't exactly endear themselves to any sort of leniency. So once the negotiations started breaking down, Israel asked a very fair question. Why should we be humanitarian towards you when you're not being humanitarian towards us? And I think that's where we're at an impasse. If Hamas simply releases all of the hostages they have, the international aid through that channel will open up and flow. But if they don't, you have to look at the real facts of the matter and what else is going to bring these people home. Hamas is effectively holding the people of Gaza hostage by not releasing these hostages. They're holding the month of Ramadan hostage by not releasing these hostages. There's no ethical situation where the hostage taker gets to have the moral high ground. So they can try all they want here, but it's not going to work with the Israelis for sure. And with the Trump administration, it's not going to play. So either they release these hostages or it's going to become a very, very scarce and frugal Ramadan, which is not at all in the spirit. So I think Hamas needs to get ready to make some concessions and make them quickly.
From your explanation, I understand the ceremonies, particularly that touched Benjamin Netanyahu in a way. But don't you think that conversation should have been had prior to phase one of the ceasefire deal? And also, I want you to answer that with, one would expect that by now Trump would have said something, especially after his open support for Benjamin Netanyahu and Netanyahu's decision to pause that. This happened from last weekend. One would expect by now Trump should have, said something. Body language seems to be, he's mute now. Is it because he's busy with the Ukraine and Russian talks?
On your first question, I agree with you. They should have definitely worked out the some of the procedural things before the ceasefire started. They had over a year of negotiations. So the fact that that was left out, or if that was potentially ignored from Hamas's side, I'm not sure. But you make a very strong point that perhaps this should have been taken care of before this started. Insofar as President Trump's delayed response, I think a lot of it comes down to Trump has come in and effectively stirred the entire pot. He made this very bold and very arbitrary declaration that Gaza is America. Well, that doesn't make any sense to anybody. So what's that going to do? It's creating a power vacuum and a lot of confusion where now the Arab world, led by Saudi and the Gulf states financially, are saying, hang on a second, we want to be part of this discussion. And Israel is saying, well, we want to be part of this discussion. And as these parties start to interact with each other in more dynamic ways, I think right now it's not in Trump's favor to come out and say anything, because if he was to come out and say, I support Israel wholeheartedly, which he has effectively done, but if he came out and said it on this, then people say, oh, you're supporting the lack of humanitarian aid. If he says simply nothing, then it's Israel who's doing that. So is that gamesmanship? Maybe, but I think you also touched on the point that he's very hyper-focused on Zelensky and Vladimir Putin and the situation in Europe. And so this week, as in the saga that is the American presidential situation, he's hyper focused there. So perhaps he's letting the Israelis take the lead on this, and hopefully, I think part of this is getting Hamas to blink. You want them to say, okay,
Okay.
geez, these guys are serious. Let me give up these hostages. So if Trump says nothing and the threat is only from Israel, Israel is much more likely to keep that threat going than the international community. So perhaps that's the game theory here, because if it is successful and if, 3 or 4 days go by and this tactic works and the hostages are released, then I think everything works out for the best. Now, if the hostages are never released and there's never any aid given to Gaza, then you start a whole new humanitarian crisis. So a lot of people are playing cards, as Donald Trump says, and they don't have the cards. In this case, Hamas doesn't have the cards to outlast Israel, and I think Trump's going to let it play out that way.
Now, Trump had said he will ensure he ends the war in Israel, Gaza. Do you see that, happening or achieving? Can he achieve that? Seems he is no longer as important in the peace talks as expected. I say that because we had in the news earlier that Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has met with EU Commissioner for the Mediterranean, which they're talking about the Hamas and Israel talks and all of that. Now that Trump is in office, seems like he was very gingered about seeing that the war comes to an end, because we know that Trump does not want war from his body language. It seems like he's taking the back seat now, not necessarily the Ukraine saga with Zelensky and all of that.
Yeah, I think he's done that in a strategic way, also utilizing the other assets in his administration, such as Marco Rubio and general back channels. Right now, Donald Trump needs the Arab world, and in this situation, unlike a lot of other situations, he needs them more than they need him. And so, in the art of the deal right now, it's in Trump's interest to see kind of how this shakes out. Can Sisi and the Egyptians come to some sort of agreement? Can the Jordanians come to some sort of agreement? Will there be offers or overtures from the Gulf states and from Saudi Arabia? As more time ticks on and there's more and more of a power vacuum that starts to emerge, I think Trump is waiting to see who will step up and who's willing to commit things. And for him to re-engage with this is very quick, because he's the kind of person who gets on a plane and gets on the ground and calls a meeting. So very quickly the focus can shift back onto this with almost a phone call. I think it is the month of Ramadan, and it's something to be sensitive towards, and it's something that he has to be reasonable in this time frame. Perhaps that's playing into it, but I think ultimately it's about letting the other actors in this game play their chess pieces, seeing where they go, who's going to ally with who's going to start making overtures without American pressure, and then he's going to come back in and try to broker and mediate this deal. And it puts him in a tough place. He brought it up when he talks about Putin and Zelensky. He has to be a mediator, meaning he has to see both people's sides, even though he might be leaning towards the Israelis and leaning towards the Ukrainians. I mean, extraordinarily leaning towards them. To be a mediator, you do need to be this pragmatic sort of central focus. And I think in the Gaza conflict, you have many more players, many more countries involved, and Donald Trump is going to have to be much more of a tactical deal maker there, where he needs a lot more allyship, and he doesn't have it right now. And so that might be why he's a little bit quieter while they work this out on the back end.
Now, details in the news from the meeting between El-Sisi and the EU Commissioner says that they would like to, reconstruct the Gaza Strip without displacing Palestinians. I know that Trump had said it's better for them, the Arab nations, to take the Palestinians while they rebuild it. I wonder how that is going to work. Plus, what can Trump do to get the faces back on track with Gaza? I know you mentioned that, mediating between the two countries.
Well, I suppose to get things back on track, he's going to have to find some sort of realistic financial deal for the situation. And that touches on your first question. Like, if you want to rebuild Gaza with the people there, that's incredibly hard to do. I mean, it's like the Palisades fires in California that just happened. You're not going to be able to rebuild those people's homes while they're still living in them. And keep in mind, many of these places have been booby-trapped with IEDs or the potential threat of IEDs. So you're going to be putting construction workers who are non-combat personnel in harm's way. The Army Corps of Engineers needs to go into these places. There's sewer situations, there's electrical situations, there's every type of infrastructure problem you can imagine. From a city planning point, you're starting at a null sect. So what do you do in that situation? You probably need to at least have a temporary place to house people, or you need to do some sort of quadrant-based development. I'm not sure what the Egyptians and the Europeans can come up with, but if they can come up with the money to rebuild Gaza with the people inside of Gaza, and it's their money and they're willing to spend it, then all the power to them. But financially and realistically, it seems to be a little bit of a difficult situation because you're going to be asking non-combatant people to go into what could be a booby-trapped war zone. And the last thing we want to do is get, some construction workers killed in a situation. So it's not quite as simple as rebuilding with them on the ground. I think maybe Sisi is going to have to be more open to resettlement, and in exchange, the U.S. is going to have to be more open to a guaranteed right of return. Palestinians who are going to have a permit or some sort of validating guarantee that they will be able to come back to what is their home. I think that's where the negotiations will go. I do not believe that it's realistic from a infrastructure growth standpoint to rebuild it with the people inside of it. You'll probably end up with more of a catastrophe than you already do.
Now, we can't thank you enough, Errol Morkoc, for joining us on
Thank you.
Arise America today. Thank you for your time.